so I think she's got some special things to share with you, both telling you and maybe even filling your bellies.
So have you studied about the Second World War at all? Yes?
Yeah. We
Great.
studied most of it last year.
Oh, very good. Okay, so I'm Kaden's Omi, so that's, in German you can say Oma or Omi. So my mom was the Oma and I was the Omi. And so all my grandkids, which there's 12 of them, call me Omi. And I'll start off with talking about where my parents were born. They were born in Bessarabia, which is now Moldova. And the way they got there is Alexander, the Tsar Alexander the First. He had a war with this part of what became Bessarabia, and the Russians took over this area, and it became.
There's a map that's
So where's Moldova? It is.
Moldova. Right here, right
Yeah.
between Romania and Ukraine.
And Bessarabia was in Romania, but the Russians moved in and took it over. And that was Alexander the First, and that was in the 1800s. And so then all of the farmers and the people that lived there fled because the Russians were moving in. So they had all this land and they had all these farms and they had no more people to farm them. So they made up a degree and they sent out to other countries, mainly to Germany, because Germany was always known for its farmlands and crops. And so they sent out looking for people to come and settle this area. And so this was in 1806. The war was between 1806 and 1812. And so then after that, they went out searching for settlers to settle this area. So 2,000 families from Germany, which amounted to 9,000 people, made the long trek, Danube River, over to Romania. And they called this area Bessarabia. So you hear of German people from Russia, and these were Germans from Bessarabia. So they settled there, and my parents were born there, both my mom and my dad, and all 4 generations back, all settled in this area, were born there, raised there. And the degree that the Russians gave to these settlers that came in, just like here in the United States when the West was settled, you could stake a claim and own that property. Well, these German people all came, staked their claim. These were now their farmlands, and what the Russians promised them was freedom of religion, no taxes for the first 10 years, and the first year that they were to settle the farms and start growing crops, they were given all the seed and everything they needed. So it was really a great deal for them to come and settle because no taxes. First year, everything given to them by the government, because the Russians really wanted to have all the farming back in this area. And it was very rich black soil, so it was good for beets and wheat and corn and everything they grew there. So anyway, this is where my parents were born. My mother's mother had 15 children, and out of those, 5 of them made it to adulthood. In that day, there was no vaccinations, and so a lot of babies, children died from childhood diseases. And my father's family had 10 children, of which 6 grew to adulthood. Then when the Second World War started in 1938, the Russians were moving in. Germany had already attacked Russia, so the Russians were moving in. They were again taken over this country of Bessarabia, which was all German. German schools, German government, everything was in German. All these people spoke the true German language. Well, when the Russians were moving in, and they had farms and vineyards, they automatically became the property now of the Russians again. So they had set up a delegation in a big school building. And on one end was the Russian delegation, and the other end was the German delegation. Hitler was calling back to his homeland all full-blooded German people. So you could either take a bag about like a big pillowcase, and you were allowed 50 pounds and nothing else. So like for my mother, they had, my 3 brothers were born there, so they packed up, the men took the wagons and horses, and the women and children were put on cattle trains, and they were started taking them down to the Danube to get on ships. Out of my mom and dad's village where they lived, Turutino, 6,800 people fled from that area. The ones that chose to go to Germany worried about, are we going to speak the same language? We've lived here for so many generations. Yes, we know we speak German, but they worried about it. Well, they spoke the High German that you read in a book, so they had no problems once they got to Germany, because in Germany there's like 46 different dialects. Like we have the South here, and the Northerns, and we all speak a little bit different. Well, in Germany there's a lot of dialects, but these people coming from Bessarabia spoke the High German, so that was very good. So when they left their land, some people chose to stay. This one lady was going to go to her vineyard to pick some grapes, and a Russian soldier standing there, you pick one grape and we'll shoot you. They're my grapes. No, they're our grapes. And she hurriedly ran to get signed up to flee with the rest of them, because nothing was going to be theirs anymore. So they got on ships, and it was very interesting because all these refugees, just from my parents' village, were 6,800 people. There were lots of villages like that. So they had a massive, massive amount of people fleeing, and they would stop, like in Czechoslovakia, in Yugoslavia, all the way on their route. They would set up big tents, and the women from that area would cook food to feed all these people. And when you see pictures of this, it's just amazing how people come together and become one, because they're all there to help each other. So they made it to Germany, and Hitler had attacked Poland, conquered Poland, and it was like, that's one of the really famous conquerors times, because he went into Poland and just took it like that. So Hitler had conquered Poland and called it Neu Deutschland, which means New Germany. So he added that country onto Germany. And when my family got to Germany, they were worried that they didn't know what to expect. There were banners and bands playing, welcoming all these people that were full-blooded German people. They put them up in my particular family. Everyone left, all my dad's family, all my mother's family, and they put them all into another school. And they housed them there, they fed them there, and it was months that they lived there, because the German government was taking into consideration what these people did back there, so that they could place them somewhere to do what they were used to doing. And in my case, my family's case, it was farming. And so all of my mom and dad's families were farmers, and they put them in the area of Neu Deutschland, New Germany. So that was typically, before that, Poland, but now called New Germany. So they put them on a farm. The first farm they put them on was a little too small, and so then the next year they moved them to a bigger farm. And the Polish people that were living on those farms became our servants. And civilian people have nothing to do with war. They take, you take what you get. My mom and dad certainly didn't want to take this property from these people, but this is what war does. So they settled there with this family, and they became good friends. They worked together, and this was all to feed the German army. So they were allowed to keep enough food, butcher one cow at the end of the summer so that they'd have food through the winter. And they lived there for the next 4 years. And this is where my sister and I were born, in New Germany. And it was nice for my families because their families were all placed, and so once in a while they could get together and see each other. Then the Russians were moving in, and this is what they were always afraid of, because the Russians were moving towards Germany, and my dad was called into like a Coast Guard type of thing. It wasn't the army, but it was the men went out to guard and to help with the military stuff. So he was gone for months. He'd come back, and when he got a hernia, and so he was sent home to stay at this farm. And so my dad never went back to the Volkssturm. And every night these men, my dad and all the men, would take turns guarding, watching for the Russians. And one night, my dad came home, and he always told my mother, "Be ready to leave, the Russians are coming in, that's the word." And this particular night he came home, he said, "Rosa, I don't like this look of the moon. The moon is big and red. It's a war moon." And she said, "Oh, quit telling me this. You always scare me." Well, he left back out to his guarding post, and wasn't long he came back and he said, "Bake some bread, pack some food, the Russians are coming." And Mother took a ham and bread, and again, just some pots and pans, things that they knew that they would need when they were fleeing from the Russians. And there again, the men took off on the horses and wagons, and the women and children were left and guarded onto a train. And this train was supposed to take them closer to Germany to get away from the Russians. And didn't work out quite that way. They got on the train, and then they were going to put them on a ship. And there were so many people trying to get on these ships, yes?
Were you born at this time?
I was born. I was 3 months old when the Russians moved in. So my mother had 5 children that she had to take care of. And the oldest one was my brother Art, who was 10 years older than I. So he was 10 and I was 3 months old. And they put him on the train, they got him to these ships, and they were going to put all these people on ships heading towards Germany. Well, there was so much commotion trying to get on the ship that most of the younger people made it on. But my mother with her 5 children and other women like that didn't make it on. And it was really a blessing. My mother really believed in angels, and she always felt like she was guarded by her angels, because she was a very Christian lady. The only thing she had with her all this time, from the time she left Romania to Poland, New Deutschland, and when we came to America, the only thing she had with her always was her hymnal that she got. It was for her confirmation when she was 13. And so there were prayers in there, and there were songs in there. And so through all the things we went through, we always prayed and we always sang. And that was just my mother in a nutshell. She was just always a very godly woman. So people that made it onto those ships was very unfortunate. They all got blown up by mines that were in those waters. And so then my mother and all these women and children just kept trekking behind the retreating German army. And there was nothing to eat. When she was under the Russians would put the women that were able to work the fields, again, just to make sure everybody got food. They would give her 1 ration. She had 5 children. So my older brothers, they learned to pick weeds, roots, berries, and the ration that she would get, she'd put into one of those pots that she took along from home, and she'd make a soup. This is what we lived on, generally just off the land. And some nights we'd sleep in ditches, and some nights in deserted castles. And when we'd come upon a farm that had been deserted, generally it was full of people that had been killed and left there. And so my brothers would learn to clean up, bury these people, and we'd stay there as long as we could, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. And sometimes she'd be under the poles, and my mother always said, you know, oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I forgot. Well, it's hidden. Sorry. So some nights we'd sleep in ditches, some nights in castles, and in these deserted farmlands. And like she always said, if we're under the Russians, they're bad. But Lord help us if we get under the poles. They were really, really bad. And the things that happened to young people, like when my mother, during the day, they would work the fields, the women that were able to work. My oldest brother was taking care of us. So he was always just like my mother to me, because from the time I was a baby and they started fleeing from the Russians, he always took care of us, four children. And, where was I going with this? So the women learned to put mud on their faces, put their scarves down, tie them like a babushka, you know, where they put them, almost looks like a Catholic nun. So they just didn't want to look attractive, and they never wanted to look into a soldier's eyes, because generally when that happened, those girls were raped repeatedly. The one girl was with my mother, her name was Olga, 17 years old, and she'd been with my mother for years, from the time they left their homeland to Poland, and now this trek fleeing from the Russians. And they raped her, and she died in her arms the next morning. My brother had to make a casket and bury that girl, and this happened a lot. So women really needed to look as unattractive as they could. Just do their work, keep their heads down. So we were staying in this place, and like I said, my mother believed in angels. Everything that happened that could have gone bad generally turned out good for her. This particular day she came home, she said, tonight, if somebody comes, say, no mamushka, no mom, we don't have a mom. Sure enough, the soldier had taken a, she could tell by the way he looked at her that he was going to come after her. It was an officer, and this was a Russian officer. The Russians were really, really bad about abusing women. It was really bad. So anyway, the soldier came, and we're all huddled together, crying. And my brother Art saying, no mamushka, no mamushka. And he had a big board, and he was wrecking things up, and couldn't find her. She had gone down in this basement, and there was a big pickle barrel where they used to pickle watermelons and everything in a big barrel. Well, she'd gotten in there and put the lid on there. But he went down there, and she could hear him coming, and he took the lid off, took his gun, pointed it at her, and she could speak enough Russian to say, 5 children upstairs. I have 5 children. And Mom said it was her guardian angel that made him turn around and stumble out of there and left her alone. And so we would follow the retreating German army. They would leave potato peelings, they would leave things that she could pick up and cook. And my sister and I both suffered from malnutrition. We got these growths on our head, which would have protruded into our skulls and our brains and killed us. And again, we ran into an angel. In the middle of a field, we ran into this Catholic nun. And my mom was saying, my girls have these growths on their head. And she cut them out right there. And surprisingly, now that we know all about these infections and things, it's surprising that we made it through that one, her guardian angel. And so this is how it went on. We'd be trekking, living in deserted houses, and just always staying ahead of the German army, the Russian army, and following the German army. Well, we ended up in a camp, which was a Russian camp. And in those days, Russian boys were taken from their homes and put in military school at a very young age. And this is why my mom always thought that maybe this is why the Russian soldiers didn't have that bonding that gave them more compassion towards women, because they were put in military schools and really never had their families around them. Well, we had 3 boys and my sister and I, and they liked my 3 brothers. And so at this camp, they had a board, and they would put the family's name on there, and whatever family name would be on that board, they would have to get on a train, and they were shipped back to Russia. And more than likely, my 3 brothers would have ended up in a military school and become Russian soldiers. And the women would, and the mom and the girls would have been sent to Siberia, which anyone that ended up in Siberia never came back. So every time our name was on that board, my mother would either find a cigarette butt and eat it so she'd get violently ill, or she'd make one of us kids play sick so that they wouldn't make you get on the train if you were sick. Well, this happened about 3 or 4 times, and she knew she couldn't get away with that much longer. So one night, there was no moon, no stars, it was a black night. My brother had the wires, and he took me, put me on his shoulders, and my mom took my little sister, and they walked into the woods, trying to get to the German section where the Americans were already setting up Red Cross places to help people that were fleeing. And again, she met another angel. We walked into the forest and ran smack dab into this French soldier who had been wounded, and he had made a makeshift crutch trying to get back to France. And he said, "My good woman, what are you doing in the middle of the forest this late at night with these 5 children?" She said, "We're trying to get to the American sector." He said, "Well, another 300 yards, and you're in a Russian camp, and they'll shoot you on sight." And he turned us around and headed us into the right direction. While we were in this camp before we escaped, my father had gotten permission to cross over to the Russian section, because as we were moving and fleeing from the Russians, the way people communicated, they would have a piece of paper, little card, and they'd put their names on there and the date that they were at this destination, and they'd nail it onto a telephone pole. And so people walking and fleeing would look for their relatives who had possibly gone by in that same area. My grandmother found my father on her birthday, knowing that he was still alive and that he was wounded and that he was in Ulm, which is a city in Germany. Well, he had been in a hospital, and somehow the word had passed to him where we were. And so he knew now that where we were, and we were in this Russian camp, which he got permission to cross over, but just for so many hours. And so he now knew where we were, we knew where he was. Because before that, they had been separated. I was 3 months old, so by then I was 4 years old. So this is how long she was fleeing from the Russians. And she had gone different places where we were. They would have welfare people helping us to get food. And in this particular place, my mom said, "I'm going to see this fortune teller because I want to know if our father is alive." And my brother said, "Don't waste your money, Mom." It wasn't money, it was stamps. "He's gone. We're never going to see him again." She said, "No, I've got to." Well, I don't know how many people believe in fortune tellers. Most people don't. But she went. And this fortune teller said, "You're going to be in a house and there's going to be steps. And you're going to hear footsteps coming. And your husband is going to find you." My brother said, "Don't believe that. No way." Well, once we escaped from this place and we got to an area that was not yet the refugee camp. We lived in this house, and these houses were all empty, so if you found an empty house, you just stayed there for a while. And sure enough, Mother heard these footsteps coming up, and she huddled us all together, told us be quiet, because we didn't know who it was. He knocks on the door and he said, Rosa, it was my dad. He found us. Another angel. My mom just always believed this. She just had such strong faith in the Lord. So he had to leave us again, but now we knew that he was alive and where he was, and we were trying to get over to the American sector. The American sector had a refugee camp that took people like us that were escaping. And when this soldier turned us around, we got headed to the American sector. We got there, and they didn't want us either because we didn't have the right papers to cross over. And they basically put my mother off and said, no, we can't accept you. You didn't get the papers to cross what eventually became the wall. They were just wires at the time that we crossed over. But she wouldn't leave, and she wouldn't leave, and this officer took pity on her, and he helped her get the papers, and we settled into this refugee camp. So this was now a refugee camp that was run by the American Red Cross. So the great thing about that was we had breakfast, we had lunch, and we had dinner every day. We all lived 7 families in one room, a little longer than this, and we'd partition off blankets, and this family lived in this corner, and blankets for that, and there were 7 families in this barrack where we lived. But there was one barrack that fixed all the food, and they gave you a bucket, and you took this bucket, and you went to the food barrack, and you got your food, and you took it back. And we had a stove in the middle of that barrack, and everybody would sit around and talk, and in the corner they partitioned off an area where kids about your age and a little older would hang out. They had a radio there so they could hear what was going on in the world. So my brother, by the time we got to the refugee camp, I was 4 years old, so he was 14. And so they had their little hangout, and they kept up with the news, and we were like in heaven, because now we were eating 3 meals a day. We had people that were friendly. My dad found us. He came to the camp and lived there. And the 4 years we spent at that camp, it was a Catholic area of Germany, and we were Lutherans. And so the Catholics gave us a church to use and a school to use, and we all lived together just fine. Catholics didn't like Lutherans over there at that time. Here we have so many different branches of religion, but over there it was Catholic and Lutheran, and they did not like each other. One day on my way home from kindergarten, the Catholics were up on this hill and throwing rocks down at us, and that's just the way it was. It all got better, of course, but we lived there, went to church every Sunday, learned to respect the one thing we did when we got out of church every Sunday is we walked in the cemetery to learn to respect the dead. And it was just, we didn't know we were refugees or that we were poor. You know, we played like kids play. There was a beautiful meadow. Us girls would sit and make wreaths to put on our hair. And all the camps were being emptied. This was already now 1952, and we got to the camp in 1948. So our camp was the last refugee camp to be emptied in Germany. And how that happened is there was a displaced person program. So we were all displaced people because we'd all lost our homes and didn't have any place to go. So countries offered to take refugees, and you could choose the country you wanted to go to, and you could sign up for it. And my mama signed up for America, and she was the only one that signed up for America. They all said, oh, you can't go there. it's the land of milk and honey. No, you're crazy signing up for America. No, I'm going to America, she said. And we got accepted, and we were sent to Munich, which is a big city in Germany, and they gave us physicals, and they taught us how to say, "Policeman, I am lost." And so from there, we went back to the camp, and during the years we lived in the camp, the Red Cross would come every Christmas, and we'd get an orange and an apple and a Hershey chocolate bar. So it was really a big treat. And an item of clothing. So I had a new dress to wear to America. And my mom gave away everything she owned, which wasn't much, but feather beds and pillows and things that the government had given to us. She gave it all away because we were going to the land of milk and honey, and they all still didn't believe it. But we left, we went to Bremenhaven, and all of my mom and dad's relatives, I don't know how they communicated, but they all were there at the ship to greet us and to say goodbye to us. Now, a lot of them hadn't seen each other for many, many years, and now they were saying goodbye to their baby sister. And my dad wasn't the baby, but his family came, her family came, and we all said goodbye, and we got on this big ship. It was not a luxury liner. It was a converted battleship. So all the men and boys slept on one end, and the women and girls on the other end. And the journey took 12 days. We hit a hurricane, and me being 8 years old, those waves looked like mountains out there. It was really scary. But it was a military ship, so everything was bolted to the floor. So none of the tables moved, and it was quite an adventure, really, you know. We ended up in New York Harbor at midnight, and the tugboats were coming to pull us in. Every person was up on deck, and there stood the lady with the torch, and she looked so big to me. I've been back to see the Statue of Liberty, and now she doesn't look that big, but I must have been because I was still so little. Anyway, we got tugged into the harbor, and we all went through Ellis Island. At Ellis Island, my mother learned another trick. She carried little red candies, and before you boarded the ship in Germany, the last thing they did was have you stick out your tongue, check your eyes and your ears, and if you had a coated tongue, they thought you were sick, they would pull you aside and you didn't get to go. And so Mom would have us suck on a red candy, make sure we had really nice pink tongues. And so we went through that. Ellis Island, they put tags on us, around our necks, your name, your destination, Sterling, Colorado, and the name of the farmer that sponsored us. These farmers just randomly accepted people. He didn't know who we were, we didn't know who he was, but they were of German descent, and they had offered to take refugees from the camp. And this is what the whole world was doing. So we were the only family out of our camp that went to America. The rest went to England and all kinds of countries, Canada, everywhere. And so we got on this train, and wow, American women. Mom, they got red lips. Mom, look at the hats. Wow. And they're smoking cigarettes with big long holders. I was very impressed with the American ladies. I think that's what put me into my field of being in the beauty industry, because I noticed that American women were so beautiful. So we ended up in Sterling, and the farmer that sponsored us had a big truck that he'd put us in. Well, my brother said, we'd seen a car every week, once a week in the refugee camp the 4 years we lived there. The mayor from the little town would drive through looking at everything, making sure everything was okay. And a car, it was a real car they were seeing. So now this farmer was picking us up in a truck. The boys got put in the back. I sat on my mom's lap, and we were riding down Atwood, is where we went to a farm. We were going to be farmers, and this was 7 miles out of Sterling. Well, when you drive 7 miles on a dirt road, pretty soon my mother started crying. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? She said, somebody fooled us, we're going to Siberia after all. Because it was so desolate. It was just farm country, hill country, sagebrush. So we worked for that farmer for the first year, and that paid for our trip. So we didn't get any money the first year. He would go to town and buy our groceries, and he would go to a sale and buy a box of things, clothes, and we'd try everything on to see if we could wear any of this stuff. And it was very, very cold out there on the farm, and we had to work out in that. In one of those boxes, there was this old-fashioned toaster, and these toasters, they opened up like this, and you put the bread in, and then you shut them. That's the old-fashioned toasters. Well, when my brother found that toaster, he plugged it in, it got red hot. He says, a foot warmer. We used it to heat our feet. Anyway, little stories like that are kind of funny to look back on, but we lived there for a year, and then that paid for our journey over here. And then he found us a job on another farm, and this was not easy work. This was hoeing beets before all the machinery. I mean, I was on my hands and knees. I never got to play with dolls or do things little girls get to do. We were working in the fields. Because when my dad would hoe and I would pull the hoe didn't take out all the weeds, so then we hand picked the rest of the weeds. And we did that year, and then he found us a job with another farmer, but now we got paid money for working. So the next farm we worked at for a year, my mother was very, very homesick. We'd come home from school, her eyes would just be red from crying because she was so homesick. And my brother found a German radio station that would have German church services, and this was very nice for her. It made her not miss home so much. And where was I going with this? I was going to anyway, lost my train of thought there. So we lived on Hergen Raiders farm was the next farm, and they had a little girl who was my age. So sorry. And she was 8 years old, and she had a playhouse outside of their house. We lived in a house. The main farmhouse was a nice big house where the family lived, and then they had like a small house where we would live. And the first house that we lived in, of course, was really, really not a very nice house. And we had fought bed bugs in the camp. When we got to the refugee camp, when you have communal living, it's very hard to keep everything sanitary. And so we had lice and we had bed bugs. And so every morning, I was 4 years old when we got there, 8 when I left. But for the first couple of years, every morning you'd line up and they put this powder on your head and they comb you out for lice. And they got rid of the bed bugs. So we get to the Atwood farm, the first house we lived in. We go to sleep, and we didn't have any furniture in there other than the beds we slept on, a table and chairs. That's no sofa, no lounge chairs. We get up. My brother Art's very allergic to bed bugs, and he was totally chewed up by bed bugs. My mama took everything out, scrubbed it down, left it out in the sunshine, and we got rid of those bed bugs. But it was hard to believe that we had to go through this again, and we were in America. So we get to the second farm, and it was a nicer house, and the little girl had this playhouse outside. And when we'd walk from our house to go work the fields, I'd see that little girl over there playing with the dolls, and I'd say, Mom, why can't I do that? They're rich. We're not rich. Only rich people get to do that. She did show me her dollhouse at a later time, and it was very nice. And so we worked that farm for the next year, and the pastor from the Lutheran church helped my mother find a house in town. And we bought our own little house, and that's where I finished growing up, in that house. And my mama got a job at a restaurant. She was a dishwasher. And my dad worked at the sugar factory, and my older two brothers continued working farm work for other people. And my mother was so proud of her job. You know, it doesn't matter what you do, it's how well you do it. So no matter what you do, you have to do it well. And she was so proud of her job. She used to tell me when I was about 10 or 11 years old, you know, Mom, what do you want to do when you grow up? You want to be a dishwasher like me? I can show you how to be a really good dishwasher. She was a great lady. She was a great lady. We were so blessed to come to this country. And in this country, you can do anything you want. It just takes hard work and being proud of who you are. You always have to take pride in loving yourself, because if you love yourself, you can love others. And that's God's greatest teaching, is love. So we were blessed to come here, and I know that I've been blessed with my family, and I don't know what else to say except it's been a long journey and it's been a great one. You have any questions?
Tell them about your education.
Oh, okay, I'll go on just a little farther. So, my father ended up becoming an alcoholic. He always wanted to go back home. I got my first full-time job when I was in 8th grade. I worked from 4 o'clock to midnight, and I would literally fall asleep at my desk in 8th grade. And the teacher, my homeroom teacher, was of German descent, and he knew my family. He knew things were not good at home, and he'd just pat me and say, "It's okay. Your grades are fine. Go ahead and sleep." Anyway, when I finished the 8th grade, I was still very, very German in thought, and I was very naive, actually. So I had gotten this job at a cactus restaurant. I was a car hop, and I had money in my pocket for the first time. I could actually go to Woolworths and buy a couple yards of material and make myself a new skirt. And you just learn to do these things when you can't buy them. And I knew when I finished the 8th grade that I couldn't give up my job because my dad was no longer working and my mother was a dishwasher. And we still didn't eat that well. And I knew the law said that you had to finish 8th grade. And so I continued working. So I didn't go farther than 8th grade. But I continued working. But I always had good self-esteem. I always felt like I was a good person. And I loved doing hair. It was just something about fashion. I started doing all the waitresses' hair in the bathroom, and if I had an extra 50 cents, I'd go buy a magazine on hair. And I really got good in hair. Everybody wanted me to do their hair. So I got married at the age of 17, and my mother would have married me off at 15 because that's what you do. You raise a girl, you marry her off. You have children. That's life. But I was 17 when I got married, and working, and always doing hair. I loved the beauty of making somebody look beautiful. Everyone can look beautiful. There's very few natural-born beauties. So, it's true. You enhance yourself by what you do to yourself. And so I kept doing hair. I got turned into the state board because I was doing so much hair in my kitchen. By now I had a baby every year for 4 years. But thank the Lord I didn't start having babies till I was 20. So that was very good. I was a little more mature. And doing hair in my kitchen table. My baby's sitting in my little rocker and combing hair. And people would give me a dozen eggs or a quarter. Anyway, it was what I loved to do, and I was taking care of my babies. And they turned me into state board. The beauty school and 3 salons in Sterling turned me in. So this very wealthy lady from Chicago had moved to Sterling, and no one could do her hair the way she was used to. because they had big hair pieces in those days. They were very popular. She heard about me and she called me up. She says, yeah, this is Marilyn, and I want to know, do you do tuck curls? And I said, yeah. Well, I want to come see you. Well, this lady started coming to me, and I started doing her hair pieces. And then you just pin them on. That was the trend at that time. Well, when they turned me into state board, she was at a beauty salon getting her eyelashes done, and she calls me up and said, you're in big trouble. I said, what? Well, they turned you into state board. And I said, oh my God. I thought, are they going to deport me? And she came to my house. She gave me her lawyer's card, and she said, when they come, you just send them to him. I couldn't have paid for a lawyer. I didn't have any money. Well, they came. They were. And in those days, state board was feared. I hate to say this, but almost like the Nazis. They were scary. I mean, today's state board is nothing like it used to. Beryl Moss, everybody knew her name, came to my door along with two others. Knocked on the door. My girlfriend happened to be there. She opened up the door, and I had hair pieces sitting on my credenza. We were counting the hair pieces. And they said, Michelle, and I came to the door and I was shaking. And I took the card and I said, you need to go see him. And man, they were so mad because I had a lawyer. They zipped out of my driveway, and about an hour and a half later, he calls me up and he says, well, everything's okay, but you can't do any more hair until you have a license. Because Colorado law at that time said if you touch more than 7 people, it's considered the general public, and you can't do that anymore. And he says, I'll tell you what, I'm not used to taking care of big criminals, so I really had a tough case here. He was making a joke, because they made it feel like you really were doing something terrible. So I didn't touch any more hair, but hair pieces and wigs were the fashion. So this lady, who had given me her lawyer, took me to Denver. I went to the bank, I borrowed $250. They took me to the merchandise mart. I bought $250 worth of wigs and hair pieces, which was a lot because my cost on those were maybe $4 a piece, maybe $4.50. And they found me a location, and this lawyer helped me find it. And I opened Irma's European Wig Castle. And I started doing wigs and hair pieces. I was in heaven. I combed like 48 a day, and I think I charged $2.50 a piece. But that's a lot of money. Oh, so then I had that 3 years, and that last year, the wife of the instructor at the beauty college asked if she could work there. And she said, I'm a stylist, but I'm tired of doing hair. I'd really like to work here and do wigs and hair pieces. I said, sure. And we became friends, and she was watching me work. She said, boy, are you wasting your time. You really need to go to beauty school. I said, what do I do to go to beauty school? And she said, well, you have to have a high school education. You can go take your GED. I said, what's your GED? And she says, well, it's a equivalency to a high school diploma. And I said, well, I only went through 8th grade. And she says, well, that's where you need to start so you can go to beauty school. I said, well, how do I do this? And she said, well, you just drive out to Northeastern Junior College and ask for Dr. Bruce Bryden and tell him you want to take your GED. I zipped out there. I said, I want to see Dr. Bruce Bryden. And he came in. He says, so you want to take your GED? I said, yes. He said, would you like to sign up for some classes? I said, no, I just wanted to take the test. Passed the test, got my license, started beauty school. And by then, my youngest of my 4 children, I had a baby every year, was starting kindergarten. So I was free to go to school. My kids were in school. And I went on to this lady from the beauty school. She helped me open my first salon. I'd never been in a beauty salon. So we bought a house, and she hired 2 stylists to work there while I went to beauty school, and I would work on wigs and hair pieces on the weekends. And then I went to my first hair show, and I saw these hair shows used to be really a big deal. People dressed in tuxedos, fancy dresses, put on competitions. Thousands of people would attend. And I saw these guys dressed up, walking around, running the competitions and running the hair show, and I said, I want to be that. So I found out how to get on the Colorado Hair Fashion Committee, took their exam, and I got on the Colorado Hair Fashion Committee. And then I started competing, and I won the Colorado Open 8 years in a row, which took me to national and international competitions in New York. And it's been a great life, just a great life. And I know I've instilled all of my good feelings about life into my kids, because they're great. My number one son.
Only son.
And only, but that's okay. So does anybody have any questions? Okay, so now I'll tell you about the dessert we're gonna have. So when you don't have bakeries and fancy cakes, they always, back in my mom's homeland, they always had flour because they grew their own wheat. They always had sugar because they grew their sugar beets. And Scrabble is German donut, and it's just fried dough. And it's been, like in the community where I grew up in Sterling, when I belonged to women's groups, when I was in Delta Xi sorority, I started a booth at the local fair. I was executive director of the Miss Northeast Colorado pageant for 5 years. And when one of my girls needed a new gown, which runs around $500, I'd whip up the dough, we'd go to a church, and we'd make $700. So Grubble was a really big part of my life, but it was the only dessert that my mom really knew. They would make kuchen for weddings and special occasions, but Grubble is a simple dessert, and it's wonderful, and it's easy, and it's what I grew up with. That was our treat. So we're gonna have a treat today. Okay, so